long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Michael Baranowski, a political scientist at Northern Kentucky University. My guest today is Helena Rosenblatt, a professor of history at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. Dr. Rosenblatt is the author of a number of books, her most recent being The Lost History of Liberalism, which we'll be talking about today. Helena Rosenblatt, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me.
You know, I thought maybe a place to start would be, well, I guess about as far back as we could start with the history of liberalism, which is ancient Greece and Rome, which is kind of a point in time that's always fascinated me. Cicero's kind of one of my personal heroes. But so can you talk a little bit about, to start with, what it meant to be liberal in, the time of Socrates or, say, Cicero?
I absolutely love that question because I'd like for us to hold on to the meaning if we can and not forget it. Certainly in the 19th century, liberals didn't forget it. So the root of the word liberal in Latin means not only freedom, but also generosity. We often hear that it's about freedom, and we forget the fact that the word, in fact, referred to both freedom and generosity. Then there was the word liberalitas, I guess translated today to liberality, and it meant the values befitting a freeborn man. So there was this aspirational ideal associated with the word. It was something to live up to. And I think that it's the dynamic interplay between these two, generosity and freedom, that led to the evolution of liberalism over the years and the debates that have been engendered about it.
And so, I mean, given that sort of definitions, aspirational and liberality, what struck me is how, I guess especially way back then, it was almost something of an aristocratic value, or I sort of see it as a virtue, I guess. But is that the case? I mean, was this something that was expected of everyone to strive for, or was it just something that the upper crust sort of thought about?
Yes, right. It was a rather elitist concept from the very beginning. I mean, these were ideals expected of citizens. And in Rome, these were already an elite. They were not slaves. Liberality in women throughout history until fairly recently was very problematic. If women were generous, it was generally considered generous in a sexual way, which was not something that was a good thing. But so it referred to the values of elite in ancient Rome. You see that in Cicero, for example, and over time it continued to do so as this elite expanded. So it meant to be liberal was a quality of noblemen. Mainly, and certainly not of the poor, who were considered to be necessarily self-regarding, even selfish. They were dependents and incapable of the kind of generous thinking and acting that was expected of a gentleman or a nobleman. So it gradually expanded from being the value of a citizen to being the value of a Christian, a nobleman, a gentleman, until it could be, by the end of the 18th century, the value of a whole society. Again, an aspirational ideal, hoping that society could be more liberal and expecting it to be more liberal over time. But it's only recently in the history of liberalism that everyone was thought to be capable of liberality.
Now, that capability is in a way tied to education, isn't it, or thought to be? I mean, I think of course, the liberal arts. And could you maybe talk a little bit about what the connection is or was seen as between being able to be kind of a liberal citizen or exercise these virtues and education?
Yes. Well, being liberal, again, going back to ancient Rome, was not regarded as something innate. People weren't instinctively liberal. This value had to be learned. And you could learn it, among other things, with a liberal arts education, which would inculcate the values necessary for these leaders of society, this elite. It Liberal arts education was not meant to give any technical training. It was really it were vocational, mechanical, if you want. Liberal arts were differentiated from the mechanical arts, and they were supposed to teach prospective citizens and elites, leaders of society, how to behave, how to speak in a way that convinced people of the virtues necessary of a citizen, and generally just how to be generous and devoted to the common good.
And I always like that distinction that's sometimes made between what are called the liberal arts and sometimes the servile arts, and sometimes my colleagues in the STEM disciplines, I like to mention that to them. Though these days it seems like we've largely abandoned, at least to a certain extent, that focus, or at least that emphasis on the liberal arts. And I think a lot of folks would say much to our detriment in the development of citizens kind of capable of exercising these virtues.
I completely agree with you. As a historian, I believe very much in the teaching of the liberal arts, and I'm worried for the future that they're under attack, frankly. And it's not that we don't need sciences, of course we do, but we need a balance. We need students to understand the past, the kind of values that have been fought for and defended, and the importance of this for our future and for our present, frankly.
Now, in the book, you write that France invented liberalism. And of course, when I think of France and liberalism, I think of the French Revolution, which was incredibly important. And I know having read the book, I know that the ramifications are so great that it would be essentially impossible to explain them in one answer. But maybe you could kind of sketch out some of the most important things that came out of the French Revolution for the history and development of liberalism.
Yes, absolutely. And this is one of the exciting discoveries I made while doing the research for this book. The word liberalism was actually coined only in around 1810 to 1812 as a result of the French Revolution, in kind of reaction to the French Revolution. Before that, of course, the word liberal existed, the word liberality, but not liberalism. And it came to refer to a cluster of concepts and ideals such as the rule of law, constitutional representative government, and a number of rights, among which I would say that freedom of thought, freedom of religion and freedom of the press were the most important. We place a lot of emphasis these days on property rights, and they were included most of the time, but I think that really the most important at the time were freedom of thought and freedom of religion, which were, of course, interconnected. Now, I say that it's important to note this so that we can avoid anachronism when we speak about liberalism. The first theorists of liberalism, it turns out, not John Locke, who is so often mentioned, although he's an important thinker, I don't want to deny that. But the first theorists of this thing we call liberalism were actually Benjamin Constant and Madame de Staël, and those in their circle or on their side, if you wish. And they were very interested in building a just state, if you wish. They were also interested in writing constitution and creating a form of government which would work for everyone. Now, throughout the 19th century, wherever you look, liberalism is associated with the French Revolution. The word liberalism doesn't even appear in American dictionaries or encyclopedias until relatively late in the 19th century. The word liberal, when it meant to something political, was often spelt with an E at the end, libéral, or rendered in italics to indicate its foreignness. This is true in America and in England. And as late as the late 19th century, in one of the encyclopedias, important ones on political science, Encyclopedia of Political Science, I think it was called. You'll have to look in my book to get the exact title. It was actually there was there was an entry on liberalism in this encyclopedia, but it was a translation of a French article. So the rest of the world was fascinated by France and its successive revolutions, the fact that it couldn't settle down, and liberalism was really always until very late in history thought of as something French, and therefore something kind of promising, but also something dangerous, since it was associated with revolutions. And I think that's why often it was rendered in italics.
Now, even before that, or slightly before the French Revolution, of course, in the United States, we had our own revolution. And in the book, you talk about how in the early 19th century, a lot of Europeans actually viewed the United States as perhaps the most liberal country in the world, even though we weren't necessarily using that word at that point. But as you point out in the book, the United States wasn't really, or at least entirely, a democratic country. And it seems to me that we conflate these words. We see liberalism and democracy just naturally going together, but that's not really the case necessarily at all, is it?
No, not at all. I mean, liberalism and democracy have in fact had a conflictual relationship throughout history. I mean, democracy is a very, very old concept going back to ancient Greece, and it's a mistake to conflate liberalism with democracy, or to think that they're natural allies, as you say. They're not synonyms. And the early 19th century liberals, the first liberals, did not conflate the two terms. I mean, in Greece, for example, democracy meant rule by the people, or even people power. And some have interpreted this after the fact as direct participation by all male citizens. Others have taken it to mean a representative system based on the suffrage of all male citizens. Either way, however, well into the 19th century, the majority of liberals were actually hostile to the idea of democracy. I mean, after all, the French Revolution proved to them that the public was really unprepared for political rights. They were ignorant, they were irrational, they were violent. The most radically democratic phase of the revolution, during that phase, the rule of law had been suspended, enemies of the people had been guillotined, and rights that liberals held dear had been trampled upon. So, and then, by the way, in the 19th century, of course, liberals looked on with frustration as demagogues and dictators manipulated the electorate, appealing to its lowest instincts and gullibility in order to enhance their power. I'm speaking of the Napoleons, the two Napoleons, and Bismarck. Again and again, these demagogues ignored and even trampled upon or abolished the rights that liberals had fought so hard for. Freedom, again, of the press, freedom of thought, for example. And yet they remained popular. So until, very late, liberals were certainly not enthusiastic about democracy. They began to think that it was inevitable, but they thought very much about how to contain democracy and how to kind of channel it in safe directions. You see this in a lot of them. I mean, we see it also in Tocqueville, which has been pointed out.
Yeah, that really struck me, because I'm reading a lot more Tocqueville, because I'm doing a course on democracy in America, and how that I wasn't aware of how significant his concerns were, and they're really kind of shot throughout the entirety of his work, which kind of surprised me a little bit, I guess.
Yeah, and the interesting thing as well is that the word democracy wasn't really stable. I mean, I at the time were fixed. I mean, I said that it could mean rule by the people or people power, but it could also mean a kind of society. And scholars have shown how Tocqueville uses the word in many different ways. I mean, I think they've said up to 7 or 8 ways in Democracy in America. So it's another complicated ideal or concept, and his skepticism about political democracy actually increased over time. It seems he was very worried about it. That's for sure, and thought of ways to contain it again, to channel it in various ways. And he was thinking about France at the time that he wrote Democracy of America. I mean, a lot of people, particularly Americans, forget that fact. So he's trying to deliver lessons to France about how to contain what was the inevitable march towards democracy.
You mentioned a little bit earlier, you mentioned Napoleon and populist dictators and movements and that sort of thing. And there was a part in the book where you sort of contrasted that with Lincoln in the United States, a very different kind of, I don't know if you call him a populist leader exactly, but it turns out actually, and this is something I had no idea of, how important the American Civil War was. I mean, not just to the liberal cause such as it was in the United States, but really around the world. What was the importance of the Civil War?
Well, the United States was really seen for a long time as kind of an experiment in democracy. Democracy in a large country was thought as a very precarious thing, if not impossible, from ancient sources and from thinking about it throughout the centuries. So many people thought that American democracy was bound to fail. When the Civil War broke out, many thought that this was just proof of what they had been saying. American democracy was not going to survive. All their predictions were coming true. Also, there was a second aspect of America which was deeply problematic to many liberals, if not all liberals, but not all liberals, but to many liberals. And that was the issue of slavery. And you see this in Democracy in America as well. Especially, I've noticed in French liberals, they speak about slavery as being a very bad and dangerous thing for America, bound to cause it to fail in the long run. So when Lincoln came along, here was a great leader who saved democracy. I think that's how they looked at him. Even though you're right, in a sense, to call him a bit of a demagogue or even a dictator, they recognized that, which is really interesting for that liberals did that. But he was seen as somebody very high-minded. By emancipating the slaves, he showed and getting Americans to accept that. He was high-minded and he was a really moral leader. There you have that concept we spoke about in the beginning about the aspirational ideal. He showed to European liberals that a moral and therefore a liberal democracy was possible. And this gave them hope about their own future. Lincoln was really a model to many people. And I think in a way they were even hoping that he could become a model for somebody like Napoleon III, who could maybe learn some lessons and turn his dictatorship into something more similar to Lincoln. I mean, it was kind of a wild idea, but but they did they to a certain extent hopeful in that direction. A dream, perhaps, that they could have a ruler like Lincoln.
One phrase that I haven't used yet, surprisingly, is classical liberalism. And, when I think about liberalism in that kind of 18th and 19th century context, that's one of the things that comes to mind first. And it's sort of, I view it as a focus on largely the market, individual rights, limited government, very limited government. And that certainly was a strand of thought or version of liberalism during that period. But that was only kind of one of I guess almost a number of strands. It was one of the fascinating things I thought about the book was how the meaning of liberalism was almost in a way battled over between these different groups over time.
Yes, you're right. The way you define or perceive classical liberalism today, it's a term often used by libertarians, for example, to refer to something exactly like small government, deregulation, or little regulation, free markets. And I think it's really kind of a misnomer, again, a kind of invention that serves a political purpose today. I say this for a couple of reasons. One is that there was no period in history where there was no government regulation, no government intervention, I should say, in the economy. It depends on where you look, for government intervention. How about slavery? How about women? How about helping certain industries in various ways? How about calling on troops to put down strikes and so on and so forth. There was government intervention all over the place if you just care to look for it. Secondly, when the term classical liberalism began being used in the late 19th century, I see it as being a kind of reading of somebody like Adam Smith, who's always been important to those who call themselves classical liberals. But they read Adam Smith in a certain way that I believe is anachronistic and inaccurate. And they're kind of picking out things in Adam Smith that suit their purposes. Those areas, those places where he talks about free markets and the need to have very little government intervention. Scholars recently have shown that this is a distortion of Adam Smith's thought. If you look at him in context, he never said anything as simplistic as that. And as you said, there was really two strands of liberalism in the 19th century. It started really to break into two, if you will, although there have always been debates, I should say, about economic policy in particular. I mean, liberals have never been of one mind. And so to sort of speak about classical liberalism was a way of differentiating and grouping together a certain liberals that came forward in the late 19th century as a result of the problems caused by the Industrial Revolution. They were opposed to people who called themselves social liberals or liberal socialists in certain cases, and said that they were more for government intervention to help the poor in this situation. So there were really two streams, if you will, that separated as a result of the problems caused by urbanization and industrialization and the appearance of something they called pauperism, this endemic poverty in the cities. So it is a term that is used for kind of political reasons and is somewhat a distortion, I think, of history.
Yeah, I totally agree. Especially, it always bugs me. I'm much more of a fan, actually, of Smith's theory of moral sentiments than I am of Wealth of Nations. But when you read that together, both of those, it just seems pretty clear to me that there's a kind of a pervasive misreading or flattening of what Smith had to say. Really.
Yeah, I was recently at a conference, and I was listening to a paper given by a prominent libertarian. I'm not going to mention his name. Very nice guy, totally misinformed, in my opinion. And he was saying that he was a fan of the Wealth of Nations and had been reading and even teaching it for years. But he only recently came across the theory of moral sentiments.
Wow!
And realized that it was quite important, really. I was like, congratulations. I've been reading the theory of moral sentiments for a very long time and talking about how it fits with the Wealth of Nations and the fact that Adam Smith was very much a moralist. He taught moral philosophy in Scotland, and you just can't read one without the other.
Yeah, absolutely. Another thread that runs really throughout the book, and I guess throughout the history of liberalism, is how opposed, especially the Catholic Church, has been. And why is it that the Church has been really a pretty consistent opponent of liberalism over time?
Well, here we really get to a kind of a tragedy of the French Revolution. This rift that was caused. Some people, think that it was really unnecessary, and that the revolutionaries made a few serious mistakes. And it's always interesting to think as a historian about circumstances and contingencies. And so it wasn't inevitable. I think nothing really is inevitable. And it's certainly not the revolution. And so what happened here was that the state, in the early part of the revolution, took over church property and nationalized it and sold off the property, basically to pay off the enormous debt, which many people think is one of the causes, if not the cause, of the French Revolution. They did this without consulting the Pope, which was kind of crazy. And then they proceeded to reorganize the parishes and the districts in order to rationalize it, quote unquote. And by doing this, they also turned priests into like salaried civil servants. All of this without consulting the church hierarchy. And to cap it off, they also passed of course, the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen, which decreed freedom of religion. Now, all of this was anathema to the Pope, Pius VI, who denounced it vehemently. And so a rift was caused here. A major rift was caused already during this earlier period of the French Revolution. But then came the terror, what we call the derailment of the revolution, and the associated brutal dechristianization campaign, when priests were forced to resign, they were imprisoned, they were killed, many had to go into exile, buildings were destroyed and vandalized. And then, there were these attempts to eradicate the Catholic Church altogether. Many revolutionaries saw the Catholic Church as their main enemy because of its alliance for hundreds of years with the absolute monarchy and its control over education, and such things. So this basically triggered this hostility, this mutual hostility between the revolution and the Catholic Church. Now, you don't want to paint this rift with too broad a brush. I mean, not all Catholics were against, liberal principles of government. There were important thinkers. I'm thinking of Lord Acton, for example. Many in America thought that the Catholic Church and revolutionary principles were absolutely reconcilable. I mean, we talked about Tocqueville. Tocqueville definitely speaks about Catholic Church in America existing very happily with under the conditions of church-state separation. And many argued that this might even be a good thing for the Catholic Church to be sort of divorced from the state, especially in its absolute manifestations. But they were such people were consistently denounced and threatened with excommunication by the popes, who insisted that liberalism was a godless philosophy, bound to lead to chaos and anarchy, and not to mention atheism. Even Pope Pius XII, as late as 1945, denounced liberalism in the most vehement of terms as something that was about banishing God from the world. The church accepted the notion of liberal democracy very late, and one has to wonder if it sort of got off on the wrong track with the French Revolution, and wonder about what might have been.
It seems to me, though, I mean, of course, institutions evolve and change over time, and the Catholic Church is no different. But if you compare, say, some of the things that Pius XII had to say with especially Pope Francis today, it feels like, and maybe this is just the Pope isn't necessarily representative of the Church, which is a weird thing to say, I know, but do you get the sense that the modern Catholic Church, especially under Pope Francis, is not really so much an opponent of liberalism these days?
Well, first of all, you're absolutely right to call attention to the fact that the Pope doesn't speak for all Catholics. Actually, there has been debates within the Church, not only over liberalism but over other things as well, as we all know. Now, Pope Francis, I'm not an expert, and I haven't really researched his use of the word liberalism. If he talks about it directly, you know that in my book I take that very seriously, really tracking the use of the words liberal and liberalism. And I'm not sure, in all of that he has said, he probably has used the word. I believe that he is accepting of liberal democracy. But again, how you define liberalism is at issue here. Catholic historians often use the word liberalism to mean like extreme individualism, an individualistic society based on the notion that, human beings are, and this is, of course, they disagree with, human beings are self-interested, are cut off from their communities, and from religion, that it's sort of a synonym of selfishness. So that there's something profoundly wrong with the moral vision and religious vision of liberalism. So they tend to use it. I mean, you'll see that in Patrick Deneen's recent book, really attacks or denounces liberalism, but he uses that definition throughout the book, if I read it correctly, and I think I do. So liberalism, we have to pay attention to how the word is used and the definition that's used. I doubt very much that Patrick Deneen is against liberal democracy. It's this kind of extreme form of individualism that he thinks is a terrible thing.
Yeah, that was actually one of the reasons I was so interested in talking to you, because I had an opportunity to talk to him on the show a while ago, and I was fascinated by his conception of liberalism and his argument, and I think it's great to be able to talk to you and put that term into this broader historical context, which I think is extremely, extremely helpful. I want to get back a little bit to modern American liberalism. And when I think of, I talked about classical liberalism, and when I think about liberalism kind of as it exists today, at least as Americans tend to see the term, to me, it kind of starts in the early 20th century with, you see the progressive Republicans, the Wilsonian Democrats, the whole progressive movement, and that kind of morphs into the liberalism of FDR in the 1930s. And to me, what connects all of this is something you mentioned actually in relation a little bit to Lincoln, is that kind of moralism, that strong moralism and kind of a big government type of focus. Is that sort of how you see the genesis of, or the kind of defining characteristics of modern American liberalism?
Well, I think a certain amount of moralism has always been there. It's been kind of a core of liberal thinking. So it's terribly unfair when I think, and wrong, historically incorrect, to call, liberalism this sort of selfish, simply rights-oriented ideology, if you will. And the word big government, of course, now has become kind of a colloquialism, but I think there's something pejorative built into it. I mean, I don't think Democrats today would say, oh, we're for big government. And I don't really think that would describe what they stand for. Something else I go into my book, in my book, is the fact that the word liberalism in colloquial parlance, again, in America means big government, while in Europe and large parts of the world, it means small government. I was just in Europe giving some lectures, and the liberal parties there, the think tanks, all are kind of confused and surprised and are fascinated by how that came to happen, which I also describe. But getting back to FDR and the New Deal, which you asked me about, I think to a large extent, and others are better experts, of course. So there's a huge scholarship on FDR and the New Deal. But the way I see it was also an attempt to, save capitalism and markets from excesses, step in to help the poor when the markets were not working, not to abolish markets or create a big government, but give people, the chance to be free and to participate in markets in a fair way. And this has been the case since the mid-19th century. The fact that therefore sort of statism or the nanny state is what the enemies of liberals, their adversaries, have said about them. It's not what they've said about themselves.
Right. And then we had, of course, World War II and the Cold War, and we look at those totalitarian governments, and it seemed like it gave critics of liberalism, or at least critics of liberalism, kind of took that as ammunition, basically saying, well, this sort of communitarian vision with a large, powerful central government, this is a gateway to this sort of totalitarianism. The phrase "godless communism" comes into play, that sort of thing. I mean, do you think that there was, maybe it's a bit of a slippery slope argument, maybe it's a lot of a slippery slope argument, but do you think that those critics had at least something of a point, or were they just sort of off base, would you say?
Well, I think, blaming totalitarianism on liberalism, which some people have done and continue to do, is terribly unfair and incorrect. I mean, totalitarianism really stood for was the absence of the rights that liberals had held so dear: the rule of law, procedures, freedoms of the press, and all of that. So I do. But it's a long tradition to say this about liberals, and I think it does come from a lot, at least from the Catholic Church, who said that by banishing God, it led to a huge state, that power was translated to the state, which was extremely dangerous. In a way, those who speak of that today, or did between the world wars and during the Cold War, who blamed totalitarianism on liberalism, were like secularizing an old argument that and it led to a kind of defensiveness among liberals, where they needed to prove, this is with the rise of fascism and Nazism and then communism, they needed to prove that they were not statists, that they were not certainly into planning, state planning. And so as I argue in my book, this is when there was this turn to rights, where they started to speak of individual rights and property rights to an unprecedented extent. They needed to prove that they were not, they weren't Reds or they weren't proto-totalitarian. And they kind of dropped, at least, we're talking also about language, about how they presented themselves, what they said liberalism was all about. And I see a lot of the moral content kind of actually dropping out, or redefined as, giving rights to people is what's morally correct. I don't disagree with that, by the way. I do think it's a generous and important thing that liberals have been involved with and continue to be. But there's this other aspect that seemed to have dropped out of the discussion, which is this duties of citizenship, devotion to the common good. And I think that this whole period then led to a kind of downgrading of the sorts of goals that these social liberals that we talked about before aspired to and wanted to institute and promote.
Because I noticed a lot of that in looking at, say, how older generation liberals, like, say, FDR or someone, talked in terms of these sort of common good. It seemed to me there was much more of a focus on common good sort of things, as opposed to a lot of modern liberals, where it's almost not all about rights, but certainly a lot more about individual rights and identity and that sort of thing. And it seems to me what you're arguing is that there's a balance that perhaps has been lost to a certain extent. Is that right?
Yeah, that's exactly what I think, and it's ultimately divisive, I think, and I don't see why the two couldn't coexist in a sense. We need to maybe figure out a way to redefine liberalism and then advocate it openly. I think it's something that, for example, people very shy away from the word patriotism, and I'm not sure if that isn't even a mistake. I mean, patriotism is not the same thing as nationalism. It's not the same thing as xenophobia. It can be a very good thing when you define it and explain it in a good, in a way. There's no reason to shy away from loving the flag and what it stands for, in my opinion. Unfortunately, weirdly, this is sort of controversial to say, and and liberal arts education, again, is very important. Let's kind of kindle a pride in what liberals have done for the world and for themselves now, and for America. This is not, as you know, since you've read my book so carefully, and I appreciate that. I don't, pretend that liberalism has all been good. That there isn't a darker side to liberalism as well that we need to recognize and denounce and fight against when it resurfaces. But all in all, so many good things have come from liberals, and I think we need to possibly stress it a little bit more.
Right. It seems to me that, I'm old enough to remember the fall of the Soviet Union and that kind of brief moment where, as Fukuyama argued, that this was going to be, the end of history, and liberalism had won, essentially, the battle of ideas. And of course, now it seems pretty clear that was, let's say, more than a little bit overly optimistic. And we see all sorts of, I think, challenges to liberalism that have arisen, not just, especially I would argue even in the last few years. And so I was wondering, what would you say are some of the main challenges or threats to liberalism now, and how maybe could we meet them, address them? What do you think?
This is the $1 million question. And I'm hesitant to give advice about the future or policies. But I mean, obviously, populism is a worrying phenomenon. It seems to be here to stay, manipulated and fanned by demagogues and dictators. It's unclear that we're able to have found the ways to combat this. And of course, it's interrelated, caused or, again, intensified by the great polarization of wealth, not only in individual countries like the United States, but across the world. I mean, there's too much money in politics. I think everybody agrees. This new media, internet, social media, cable news, talk radio, where to start? And there's I worry about a certain despondence, even a turning away maybe from political participation by the young. Kind of, again, we go back to, you can't really blame them, but a pursuit of vocational training to go get a job. I think more than ever before, college students seem to be concerned with that rather than with, frankly, saving democracy. And this could be very much partly a result of the failure of education. Now, and I'm forgetting the big problem, which is, of course, immigration. Who gets to decide who is a citizen, and who is not? I mean, this is a great challenge that we're confronting. Have I mentioned?
There's a lot that, to me, I guess one thing, and maybe it's because of the business I'm in. I mean, I'm a college professor. And so to me, that focus on education, how it seems like even the liberal arts now are trying to defend themselves on the grounds of kind of career advancement and that sort of thing. And I've read I'm sure not nearly as much as you, of the ancient authors, but that focus on if you want to have a democracy, you have to have virtuous citizens, and that kind of training and education in virtue seems to be something that's kind of gone by the boards in a lot of ways. And to me, that kind of gets at almost the root of a lot of these other problems. I don't know.
I completely agree with you. I find it ironic and kind of sad that when I read that, liberal arts are defended by saying, "Oh, there's proof that uh, uh, people with liberal arts degrees end up earning more money than those without." What kind of argument is that? This is what I mean. Yeah, I suppose that's a very good thing, but is that really what how we defend the liberal arts? Surely we can come up with something more important along the lines you just described, and that go back so many centuries. So yes, please, let's save the liberal arts, but as a conduit to good citizenship.
Well, on that note of save the liberal arts, which we both heartily agree on, I think we'll close. Helena Rosenblatt, I thank you so much. I loved your book, and it was great having the opportunity to talk with you today.
Thank you. I enjoyed it tremendously too.
That's it for this episode. Thanks for listening. We hope you liked what you heard. Listener support is what keeps the show going, and we truly appreciate it. When you become a monthly sustaining supporter of the show on Patreon, you get not only our gratitude, but a supporters exclusive bonus episode each week. And supporters at various levels can get additional bonuses like Politics Guys gear and access to a special supporters-only Facebook group. To learn more, go to patreon.com/politicsguys or visit the support page on our website, politicsguys.com/support. Subscribing to the show also really helps, as does sharing episodes, which is easy to do right there in your podcast app. Word of mouth really is the best advertising, and we greatly appreciate it. Leaving reviews and ratings on iTunes or whatever other podcast app you're listening to on also really helps. And hey, if you've got a question, comment, correction, or just want to say hi, you can reach us at mail@politicsguys.com. There's also our Facebook page where you can message us and when we post stuff throughout the week. That's facebook.com/politicsguys page. We're also on Twitter @politicsguys. The executive producers of the Politics Guys are Michael Baranowski, Jay Carson, Bruce Johnson, Wilma Moreno, and Benji Fishman. Today's show was produced by Michael Baranowski. We'll be back with a new show on Saturday. We hope you'll join us.